Most people think this story is about basketball. It isn't. It's about leverage, asset concentration, and what happens when a single individual becomes more valuable than the system built to contain them. In every major sports league, revenue is spread across stars, teams, media partners, and sponsors. That balance keeps the league in control. But occasionally, that balance breaks. One player doesn't just contribute to the business, they become the business. That's where this situation starts. When Caitlin Clark entered the professional level, the assumption was simple. She would raise visibility, help ratings, and gradually blend into the league's ecosystem like every other star before her. That assumption collapsed almost immediately. Attendance spikes followed her. Broadcast windows shifted around her. Merchandise sales clustered around her name. Road games suddenly mattered. From a business standpoint, that's a warning sign, not a celebration. When demand concentrates too heavily around one asset, it creates dependency. And dependency flips power dynamics. The league stops being the platform and starts being the middleman. This is where many people misread what's happening. They frame the tension as cultural, emotional, or political. But the pressure isn't coming from feelings. It's coming from numbers that no longer line up. A league can survive player dissatisfaction. It cannot survive revenue asymmetry. Because once one player demonstrably drives a disproportionate share of attention, ticket sales, and media interest, every negotiation changes, whether the league admits it or not. Compensation debates become existential. Labor talks become time-sensitive. And brand partners begin planning contingencies. That's not drama. That's basic risk management. And the moment that risk becomes visible, the conversation stops being about fairness and starts being about control. Every league tells a story about itself. The story is stability, structure, collective growth. The idea that no single player is bigger than the system. That story works, right up until the numbers start disagreeing with it. And that's exactly what's happening here. Internally, leagues track everything: minute-by-minute viewership, ticket demand elasticity, merchandise velocity, social engagement tied to broadcast windows. When those metrics cluster too tightly around one name, alarms go off. Not publicly. Quietly. In boardrooms and partner calls. Because concentration risk is dangerous. From the outside, it looks like excitement. From the inside, it looks like exposure. If one player drives a disproportionate share of value, the league's leverage weakens. Sponsors don't negotiate with the platform anymore. They negotiate around it. Media partners start asking uncomfortable questions about scheduling flexibility. Advertisers want guarantees tied to appearances, not seasons. This is the moment where compensation debates quietly become irrelevant. The issue isn't whether players deserve more. The issue is whether the league can afford a disruption at the exact moment its value is most concentrated. That's why timing matters so much here. Labor disputes are manageable when demand is evenly distributed. They are catastrophic when demand is fragile and centralized. A missed season doesn't just pause revenue, it reroutes it. Attention doesn't wait. It migrates. And once it migrates, it rarely comes back in the same shape. This is the part many fans underestimate. Viewers don't follow leagues. They follow stories. They follow stars. Platforms are replaceable. Visibility is not. If you're enjoying this kind of breakdown, not hot takes, not outrage, just clean analysis, this is exactly the kind of conversation we keep having here. Subscribing just makes sure you don't miss the next layer when things get more complicated. And they do get more complicated. Because once the league's internal math changes, external partners stop behaving like partners. They behave like insurers. They hedge. They prepare alternatives. They ask, quietly, what happens if the league can't guarantee continuity? That's when the balance of power begins to tilt, not because anyone makes a dramatic move, but because everyone starts planning for one. And at that point, the league isn't negotiating from strength anymore. It's negotiating from exposure. Leagues like to believe they set the tempo. In reality, brands do. A league's job is governance. A brand's job is risk elimination. When uncertainty appears, Brands don't wait for clarity, they create alternatives. That difference in incentives explains almost everything that happens next. From a business perspective, Caitlin Clark isn't a player. She's a growth vehicle. Her value isn't measured in wins or standings, but in visibility density. How much attention she pulls, how reliably she converts casual viewers, and how transferable her appeal is across platforms. That last part matters most. Leagues create context. Brands create portability. If a product depends entirely on one league operating smoothly, it's fragile. If it can survive outside that structure, it's insulated. Brands always choose insulation. This is why signature branding changes the equation so dramatically. The moment an athlete becomes the centerpiece of a long-term product line, their availability becomes non-negotiable. Visibility gaps aren't just inconvenient, they're costly. Missed windows can't be recovered later. So when instability enters the picture, brands don't ask who's right. They ask how to maintain exposure. That's the key distinction people miss. This isn't about loyalty or favoritism. It's about control of outcome. A brand with global infrastructure doesn't need to wait for a domestic league to resolve its internal conflicts. It can create its own stage. Once that option exists, the league's leverage weakens instantly, even if it's never used. Because the threat doesn't need to be public. It just needs to be credible. This is where the power dynamic quietly flips. The league still has contracts. It still has rules. But the brand has something more important: optionality. The ability to pivot without losing momentum. And when one side has options and the other doesn't, negotiations stop being symmetrical. This is also where perception becomes dangerous. Publicly, everything looks calm. Commercials run. Campaigns launch. Smiles stay intact. But underneath, contingency planning is already happening. Calendars are being drafted. Backup exposure paths are being modeled. That doesn't mean anyone wants conflict. It means conflict no longer scares the most powerful player in the room. And when fear disappears, leverage follows. To most people, turning down a large check looks irrational. In business, it can be the smartest move you make. Short-term money sets long-term ceilings. The first number you accept doesn't just pay you, it labels you. It tells every future buyer what they're allowed to offer. That's why early deals are rarely about cash. They're about positioning. When a rising asset says no, it sends a signal. Not defiance. Confidence. It says, this price doesn't reflect future demand. And that distinction matters more than almost anything else. Accepting an early offer can feel safe, but safety locks you into a valuation that's hard to escape. Once a market agrees on your price, breaking out of it requires overwhelming proof. Not potential, not buzz, but undeniable leverage. This is why elite agents and corporate advisors often encourage patience even when the numbers look life-changing. They understand that scarcity is more powerful than availability. Visibility without desperation drives bidding behavior. Silence, when backed by confidence, increases curiosity. From the outside, people interpret these decisions emotionally. Loyalty, rest, focus, commitment. Those narratives are convenient, but they're rarely the real reason. The real reason is timing. If you know your visibility is about to peak, you don't anchor your value early. You let the market chase clarity. You wait for competition to form. You allow multiple parties to realize they don't want to be the one who missed the opportunity. That's how leverage compounds. And once leverage compounds, the conversation changes. Offers stop being framed as opportunities and start being framed as access. Not will you join us, but what would it take? This is also where patience becomes uncomfortable for everyone else. Fans want certainty. Leagues want commitment. Media wants clean narratives. But leverage thrives in ambiguity. The longer a high-value asset remains unattached, the more powerful their eventual decision becomes. Because the market isn't paying for what you've done. It's paying to make sure you don't do it somewhere else. American sports leagues like to think they're the center of the basketball universe. From a global business perspective, they're just one option. Outside the US, Athletes aren't valued primarily as league contributors. They're valued as standalone attractions. That difference changes everything: contract structure, compensation, control, and expectations. In many international markets, the question isn't, how does this player fit our system? It's, can this player pull attention at scale? If the answer is yes, the rest becomes negotiable. That's why foreign leagues and exhibition circuits operate so differently. Shorter commitments, fewer games, massive appearance fees, housing, security, travel, and brand integration all bundled into one offer. The athlete isn't treated as labor, they're treated as inventory. And inventory that sells doesn't need a long season. This is where domestic leagues lose leverage without realizing it. They're built on continuity, schedules, parity, collective bargaining. Global operators are built on moments, events, spikes in attention that can be monetized quickly and aggressively. From a cold business angle, this is brutally efficient. You don't need fans to understand standings. You don't need long-term loyalty. You just need visibility and scarcity. A limited number of appearances creates urgency. Urgency drives pricing. Pricing justifies investment. That's why international offers often look absurd when compared line by line to domestic salaries. They're not paying for production over time. They're paying to borrow relevance. And that relevance doesn't belong to the league. It belongs to the individual. This is also where politics fade. There's no internal resentment to manage. No locker room narratives. No pressure to distribute attention evenly. The star is the point. Everything else is support infrastructure. For an athlete at peak visibility, that environment isn't just lucrative, it's clean. Fewer obligations. Less noise. More control over brand alignment and public presence. That's why these markets don't need to compete with American leagues directly. They don't need to replace them. They just need to offer something the league can't: flexibility at scale. And once that option exists, it becomes part of every calculation, even if it's never taken. Because leverage isn't about where you go. It's about proving you don't have to stay. Most people assume the league's biggest mistake was financial. It wasn't. Money problems can be fixed. Structures can be renegotiated. Revenue splits can be adjusted over time. What's much harder to repair is perception, especially when it hardens internally and externally at the same time. The real misstep was treating a concentration of value as a cultural inconvenience instead of a strategic emergency. When a league produces a player who clearly drives disproportionate attention, the correct response isn't to normalize it. It's to protect it. Not publicly glorify it, not politicize it, but quietly build guardrails around it. You stabilize the asset while you rebalance the ecosystem. That didn't happen. Instead, the league allowed ambiguity to linger. It allowed mixed messaging. It allowed narratives to form that framed success as something to be managed rather than leveraged. From a business standpoint, that's dangerous. Markets interpret hesitation as weakness. Even worse, it created the impression that visibility was a burden rather than a gift. For sponsors and partners, this raises immediate red flags. Brands don't want to invest heavily in an environment that seems uncomfortable with its own growth engine. They want alignment. They want clarity. They want assurance that the league understands what it has and intends to maximize it responsibly. When that assurance is missing, they stop waiting for answers. This is where the league's internal priorities quietly diverged from external expectations. While leadership focused on long-term equity conversations, external stakeholders focused on short-term exposure risk. Those two timelines don't coexist easily. And when timelines clash, power shifts to whoever can move faster. The league assumed continuity. It assumed participation. It assumed that visibility would translate into patience. That assumption works when the system is indispensable. But the moment the system becomes optional, assumptions become liabilities. This isn't about intent. It's about incentives. The league's incentive is stability. The market's incentive is optimization. When those incentives collide, the side with more flexibility wins. And flexibility, in this case, doesn't belong to the league. When people imagine a star leaving a league, they picture chaos. Public statements, lawsuits, outrage, headlines screaming betrayal. That's not how it usually happens. In reality, the most damaging exits are quiet. There's no announcement that changes everything overnight. There's just a shift in attention. Fewer appearances. Fewer moments built around the league's schedule. A gradual rerouting of visibility toward events, exhibitions, and platforms that don't require league infrastructure. From the outside, it doesn't even look like an exit. It looks like flexibility. This is what makes it so dangerous for the league. There's no villain to point to, no rule to enforce, no clear line that's been crossed. The athlete is still playing basketball, still visible, still relevant, just not exclusively within the league's ecosystem. Economically, the impact compounds fast. Broadcasters notice ratings volatility. Sponsors quietly reallocate budgets toward assets they can activate without scheduling risk. Secondary players lose the halo effect that comes from sharing attention with a dominant draw. Road games stop selling out. Social engagement flattens. None of this happens at once. That's the problem. By the time it's obvious, it's already structural. And here's the part leagues struggle to accept. Once the market proves it can access the star without the league's bargaining power doesn't just drop, it resets. Every future negotiation happens under the shadow of that alternative. At that point, even returning doesn't restore leverage. The precedent exists. Optionality has been demonstrated. This is why leagues fear normalization of absence more than absence itself. A missed season is survivable. A proven workaround is not. Because once fans learn that the product they care about isn't dependent on one platform, loyalty shifts. Not emotionally, behaviorally. They follow what's available, not what's official. And that's the quiet risk sitting underneath every conversation happening right now. Here's the part that makes people uncomfortable. Nothing dramatic has to happen for the outcome to be decided. There doesn't need to be a strike. There doesn't need to be a public split. There doesn't even need to be a single confrontational decision. From a cold business perspective, the leverage has already moved. Quietly, predictably, and almost invisibly. The league is negotiating from a position of preservation. It needs continuity. It needs centralized control. It needs its most visible asset to remain anchored to its calendar. The market is negotiating from abundance. Brands have alternatives. Broadcasters have flexibility. International operators have capital and fewer restrictions. And the athlete at the center of it all has something far more powerful than a contract. Optionality. That's the word everything turns on. Optionality means no urgency, no desperation, no obligation to prove loyalty. It means every delay increases leverage instead of reducing it. It means silence can be strategic. It means waiting is not a risk, but an advantage. This is why the conversation around loyalty misses the point entirely. Loyalty is what systems ask for when leverage is slipping. Markets don't reward loyalty, they reward scarcity, timing, and control. And right now, control doesn't sit with the league. The most telling detail in all of this is how calm the situation looks on the surface. That's usually the sign the outcome has already been modeled. The plans have already been drafted. The contingencies already exist. Leagues lose power not when stars leave, but when stars no longer need them to remain relevant. That's the line that's already been crossed. If you made it this far, you're not here for surface-level takes. You're here to understand how power actually moves behind the scenes. Drop a comment with what you think the league does next, hit like if this changed how you see the situation, and subscribe for more breakdowns like this, because this story isn't ending, it's just getting quieter.